Hi, Amy. How are you doing?
Hi, Tristesse. Thank you so much for inviting me to chat.
Yeah, I'm excited about this. I think it's going to be a really timely conversation. I wanted to introduce you to our audience by reading out the statement that you sent me. Amy writes, as a project-based artist, my studio research manifests through printed matter in flat, spatial, and time-sensitive manners. Archives, historical documents, and photo-based media are activated through collage treatments, encouraging a liminal space where print and paper transcend their material qualities and shift from their original meanings. My practice addresses both the history and fate of printed matter as tangible elements in a virtual era. We may need to learn to read again for the first time. There's just so much to unpack here. So let's just get into the first question and we can start to do that. Can you just tell me a little bit about your work and the materials you use and just give us a kind of baseline?
For sure. So this is one of the things that I touch on in a couple different ways in the statement that you read too. All of my work kind of centers around a relationship with printed matter. So like paper, images, anything that uses paper as a material, I'm really interested in bringing into my practice. Part of that's because I've worked as an archivist. I've worked as a printmaker. I work as a professor, but I also have a really deep relationship with paper as a material.
Can you just say the words that you use to describe your work, and then
for sure,
yeah, just like maybe read them off to me, and then I'll ask you the next question.
So some of the keywords when folks ask me what my work is about, I'll say things like survivalism, apocalypse, architecture, things like what I call radical nature, and we can talk about that. I'm really interested in repetition. And that can be where I've done work that's more about performance, where I'm doing willfully repetitive labor. So labor is a word that I use to describe my work. I'm also really interested in moments of futurisms, so different ways of looking at the future. Another way we could talk about that is post-apocalypse. So what happens after big change?
Yeah.
And those tend to be, without getting into like the material words like collage and drawing,
Yeah.
I tend to talk about my work more in terms of the themes that I'm interested in, the topics, rather than the techniques.
How do you like bring all those ideas around paper and your interest in the way that paper works and the content that you're presenting?
For sure. So one of the things that's maybe good to focus on if we're thinking about the collage work that I make, is that I'm really interested in mashing up a sense of time, but also a kind of sense of what has been and what will be. So a lot of my collages take from printed material that was made in the 1960s and the 1970s. And then I'm also interested in cutting things out, mashing them up, so that we're maybe also thinking about the future. So a lot of my printed work and my collage work tends to be kind of shifting between this sense of something historical and something futuristic. And a lot of the ways that I've kind of wrestled with that materiality and also that topic is to think about things like survivalism and things like the apocalypse. And I don't necessarily think about apocalypse as always a doom and gloom thing. One of the things that I'm really interested in is that apocalypse, if we look at like the root of the word, is actually about massive change.
When I look at your pieces, I understand what you mean by liminal spaces, but I'm wondering if you could dig a bit deeper into that.
For sure. So one of the things that why liminal space is a really good word for me, and that it's not just an art word. I'm not just trying to use it because it's fancy.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that it's the really right word for me with my practice is that a liminal space is an in-between space. So it's in the state of becoming, or in the state of becoming something different. And with a lot of the collage work, what I'm trying to do is describe something that's in between, say, architecture and landscape, something that's in between the past and the future.
Yes.
And so what the word liminal does is it allows me a little bit of room. Instead of saying my artwork is about architecture or it's about survivalism, is that liminal spaces allow me to say, well, I'm actually interested in what happens in between those two places. And I think it's hard sometimes because often when someone says, what's your work about? You want to have like an on-point answer. One of the ways that I've found of kind of giving myself a bit of room in describing my work is to actually say, well, my work is about in-between places. It's about this liminal space where I'm really curious about not exactly what something is, but maybe what it could be. So that's sort of and I think it gives me permission to also really dig into process with my work. So rather than destination of having something that's an answer, I'm really interested in the space between starting something and finishing something. And that's also where liminal space becomes really exciting.
It also allows people, you know, anybody who wants to be creative to sit down and not have to reach the goal and
Totally.
try to explore. I think it's a really good recipe in a way to think about art in order to come up with your own voice.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah, I think about this question a lot. And I think the reason why I think about it is because I recognize that I always have a desire to finish something, like to make something that's ready to go to a show or that's maybe going to lead to the next body of work. But it's almost like I want to keep reminding myself and keep asking myself to pay attention to what's happening in the moment, to pay attention to what my actions are doing now, so that I'm not so focused on the end that I don't pay attention to what the materials are doing right now.
So the next question I have for you is that we're living in this, we're right in the middle of this moment with the coronavirus that our worlds have really changed. We're living change right now. So you're kind of such a timely person to talk to about this. Your artwork relates to preparing for the future or looking at the past to manage or understand these weird big changes we're in right now.
Yeah, it's something I don't know if I've ever wanted less to be very timely with my work. Because the body of work that I've been addressing for the last year and a half has been about fallout shelters.
Yeah.
And so thinking about safety dwellings, safety spaces that are either underground or isolated from the rest of the world. And this has been something where I've really had to, when I started this work, I was imagining it. And now in a way, we're kind of living it. So one of the eras that I'm really interested in exploring is actually Cold War era. Part of the reason that I'm looking at that is because of my exploration of fallout shelters and survival bunkers. And what's been interesting about that is that in that particular moment in history, we have a lot of social panic and public unrest. And a lot of that manifested in a kind of preparedness that was about building underground shelters for something that may never and did never happen.
Right.
But on the tail end of that, you get a huge upswing in things like suburban developments. And so architecture was changing both below ground and above ground.
Right.
And at that particular moment in time, too, we had a lot of people who were authors, fictional writers, who were taking the feeling of the moment and writing it into possible futures. So thinking about things like science fiction,
Right.
and not just the architecture architecture of science fiction, but also that idea of the public state of being, the collective state of mind, how that shifts and changes depending on what's going on around us that we're all experiencing. And so for me, even if I'm using references where I'm not actually depicting human beings, there aren't a lot of human figures in the work that I'm making. I think all of those markers, architecture, landscape, land use, they're all ways of talking about different moments in time, both in the past and then potential futures.
You work with a multitude of materials. So I know that you make these beautiful sculptures, as well as collage, and you've talked about some of your performance work. But I would like to ask you about the collage.
Sure.
When you're constructing a collage, what are your guiding principles when you sit down to build a collaged artwork? And do you set a criteria for yourself each time?
So normally what I go in with is a theme. So I'm interested in an idea, and what I'll do is I'll set up a really broad theme, so that I can start to kind of hunt and peck at different images or components or textures that might start to address that theme. What I tend to do that served me really well is, rather than trying to fit things together before I even find the images, is that I go in and I say, okay, I'm going to cut all of the mountain shapes. I'm going to cut all of the plant shapes, and I'm going to cut all of the roof lines of all of these architectural pieces. And then I start to treat them as kind of like a puzzle that doesn't have a solution yet. So I'm looking for how those components might fit together to create a sum of the parts that are greater than what they might be individually. The sort of nuts and bolts fundamental side of building those collages is then I start getting into like, okay, where's the light source? So
Nice.
if I'm thinking about like just fundamentals of making an image, know where the light source is, all of those different components start to make sense together. Or maybe there's a through line that I want to follow that really unites the composition. So I'm looking not only through the idea of what I want to be making, but also like just good visual fundamentals of how can I make these parts cooperate and seem like they belong together.
So with collage, I guess what I'm responding to is just that if you're cutting up all these things, then stop looking at them as the things that they were and start to think about what you're seeing that connects them all.
Absolutely.
Does that,
Actually, I think that relates 100%, because when I'm making collages, a lot of the time I will make them, and then if I don't know how to resolve them or if they don't feel finished, I'll actually turn them upside down. So a lot of the compositions that I work on seem as though they could be either right side up or upside down. They have kind of like a top and a bottom, almost like a planet you could flip over and it's still right side up. And I think there's something in that, like as soon as you can let go of what the thing was, you can treat it as raw material to make something new.
So let's take a look at one of your pieces and break it down. Which one do you want to talk about?
I thought we could chat about one from a series of works that I've done called Futur Infinitif. With this collage, I thought it would be good to talk about, because right from the beginning, the composition has kind of a lot of central gravity, and then it has a pretty dynamic negative space. This is something that I'm always interested in terms of building an interesting image, is creating a density or a gravity, and then also being really conscious about how the negative space is just as important. Whether we're talking about drawing or sculpture or collage or painting, one of the things that can be really challenging to do as an artist is to bring a sense of gravity into a two-dimensional space. And I've kind of made this doubly hard for myself, because with this image, it is its own planet or its own body.
That's exactly how I describe it.
Totally. So it's floating in space, which means that all the parts within it have to really hold together. So one of the ways that I've used, especially in this collage, of really asking all those pieces to talk to one another and to hold together, is to look at my light source really closely.
Mhm.
So making sure that the pieces that I'm choosing, the light source is shining from one side so that they all look like they're kind of receiving one light source, even though there's almost 13 different components in that.
Mhm. I think when I look at your work, it often kind of looks like it's been photoshopped. It's so seamless, but it's not
Yeah.
photoshopped. It's
No.
all cuts.
Yeah.
So what is your like favorite tool that you use to cut with that can get those beautiful, clean cuts?
So number one for me is a really good knife, but I have props here. I
Okay.
have, I just use a regular box cutter. It's like a small box cutter.
Mhm.
The thing for me that I've realized, and this is something that I sort of have to, I'm very frugal. And one of the things that I just can't be frugal with is blades. So rather than trying to find a really fancy knife, I replace my blades all the time.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so I also have a really great pair of scissors that I work with. And these, I'm reaching for my props again.
Yeah.
These are a set of scissors by Fiskars. They make really great blades. A lot of people use these for textiles. And I usually replace my scissors every year.
How did you get started as an artist? Like, what was the moment where you, well, not the moment, but maybe where you started to realize like that's what you wanted to do?
For sure. I've always been really interested in making. I made a lot of books when I was a kid, and I think part of it was going through high school, knowing that I wanted to do something that was really creative, but not necessarily having the direction that I needed. And so I tried a lot of things, and I think that actually helped me a lot. So I did a lot of photography. I did a lot of writing. I drew like a mad fiend. And a lot of those moments led me to realizing that that's actually how I wanted to spend the majority of my time. And when I really took stock of what I would do when I wanted to feel like the best version of myself, it was always something creative.
Yeah.
And then when I had choices to make about going into university, I'm really honest with people about this. I started my degree kind of 3 different times. So I went
Mhm.
into undergrad in design at first because I thought that would lead to a job. And then I switched into painting at a certain point because I thought that's what I wanted to do. And then ultimately I switched into printmaking because that's where
Right.
I really felt at home.
You know, you have to do a certain amount of growing up, and that it's just lived experience that will help you then start to make decisions coming from yourself about what you need to do. And
Totally.
that looks like this. It
Yeah,
looks, it just,
absolutely.
yeah, it can, you know, it's not just a straight beeline to that goal.
If it's only ever a straight path, it means that you're not paying attention to what else is going on
Right.
in the studio, on the road, around you. And it's really important to listen to that stuff.
Do you have any piece of advice that you would have passed on to your younger self that you
Hmm.
feel has been really important to you growing as an artist?
Um, I think we touched on this a little bit. I teach as well, and something that I'm constantly trying to get my students to realize is that the process is where it's at. And that's something that I wish I would have, that I could tell my younger self, because I was really focused on end results, finished product.
Mhm.
And it's taken me a long time to train myself to really dig into the how and the why of making. And the way to do that, I think, is to really understand and to pay attention to process. That's where all the learning is.
Mm.
And also to make better friends with failure. And what I mean by that is, like, I think we tend to avoid doing things that we aren't the best at, or we choose things that we know we're really good at. But all the learning and all the growth happens when you try something that you might not know yet, and
Mhm.
to really explore that and to give yourself the time and the space to figure it out and to fail at it, like to get good at it by not being good at something at the beginning, and really being patient with yourself and trying it more than once, really developing skill through time rather than expecting ourselves to just be instantly good at something that we try.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I hear you. That's a really good piece of advice. Okay, so finally, would you assign us a little art project?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So what I'd like to assign for everybody is to take a little bit of what we've been talking about with process and bring that into their own project. So my assignment is to start looking at the world around you and to pick out from printed matter. So like magazines, paper, anything that's printed around you, and to start looking for textures, shapes, and maybe objects that you want to cut out that you find interesting. And from those things of interest, we're going to pay attention to getting some really nice close cuts and to making some nice pieces of the puzzle that we're going to use to build our own shelter. So if we think about things that bring us comfort, it could be color, it could be being out in nature, it could be the home that you're in. Think about those things as you're looking for your printed matter components. Cut them out, and then bring them together in a shape that suggests for you a shelter that brings you comfort.
Perfect. I love it. It sounds great. Cool. And what would you suggest in terms of like putting the material that what could you use to glue it down?
So what I normally use when I'm making a composition, and a lot of folks are like, oh, that's so simple, is just a really good glue stick.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important if you've got an oohoo stick. I'm going to do another prop. So what I love about these glue sticks that is not the same as other glue sticks is that they're actually acid free. So they're not going to turn a different color over time. So if you have a glue stick like this, your collage is going to last a lot longer.
Aimee, if we want to learn more about you, where can we find you online?
So please feel free to visit my website at www.aimeebrown.ca, or you can find out what I'm working on. I tend to do updates about my walks and my day-to-day life, and then artwork that's in progress on Instagram. So I'm at Aimée Henny Brown
on Instagram, and I will put that in the show notes. And I will also put down your art prompt for us. And thank you so much for giving us your time today. I've learned a lot, and I'm excited to try this out.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me to chat, Tristesse.
Okay, take care.
You too.
Bye.